Russia's greatest mystery finally solved by AI. Dyatlov Pass was far worse than we thought. 9 young hikers walked into the Ural Mountains in the winter of 1959, and only their bodies walked out. Somewhere in the middle of the night, on a slope so gentle that investigators refused to believe it could kill anyone, something happened that made trained, experienced mountaineers slice open their own tent from the inside and run barefoot into air cold enough to stop a heart in under an hour. For 60 years, nobody could explain why. But in recent years, researchers armed with modern engineering software and decades of accumulated snow science finally built a model detailed enough to recreate that night almost minute by minute. What it shows is not a monster, not a cover-up, not aliens. It's something colder, and in its own way more disturbing, because it proves that ordinary nature, under exactly the wrong conditions, can look indistinguishable from a massacre. In late January of 1959, 10 students and young graduates, most of them connected to the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the city, then called Sverdlovsk, set out on a skiing expedition into the northern Urals. This was no casual trip. It was a Grade 3 route, the hardest classification in the Soviet hiking system, and several members held advanced wilderness certifications. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student known for being meticulous and calm under pressure. The plan was to reach a mountain called Otorten, ski back out, and be home before February ended. What makes this case unusually well documented is that the hikers carried cameras and the film survived. It shows a group of friends who look, by every measure, happy, throwing snowballs, mugging for the lens with frost on their eyebrows. Their journals read like the diary of any group of 20-somethings on a long trip, full of small complaints and inside jokes. Nothing hints at fear or danger, which is part of why the ending is so hard to process. On January 28th, one member, Yuri Yudin, turned back early because of joint pain. He said goodbye to his friends and went home, and would spend the rest of his life as the expedition's only survivor. The remaining 9 pushed on. By February 1st, they reached the base of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kolet, meaning roughly dead mountain, a name that predates any of this and had nothing to do with what followed. Rather than camping in the shelter of the tree line, the group pitched their tent out on the open, exposed slope. That is the last confirmed decision we have real evidence for. The final photographs show them digging into the hillside as daylight fails. After that, the record simply stops. When the group missed their scheduled check-in, search parties mobilized slowly at first, but as weeks passed, the families grew frantic. A large search effort eventually pushed into the same wilderness. On February 26th, searchers found the tent, half collapsed under snow, cut open from the inside rather than through the entrance. From it, a line of footprints led downhill toward the forest. 8 or 9 sets of tracks, some barefoot, some in a single sock, none in boots, moving in a loose, orderly line rather than scattered chaos, as if the group had left together and stayed together. The first bodies were found near a large cedar at the forest's edge. 2 of the youngest men, near the remains of a fire too small and damp to have burned long. Branches on the cedar had been broken off higher than a standing person could reach, suggesting someone had climbed it. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies lay at intervals, as though trying to climb back up the slope before collapsing. These 5 deaths were ruled death by exposure. Tragic, but explainable. It was the second search wave in May, once snow began melting, that turned tragedy into enduring mystery. In a ravine beyond the cedar, searchers found the last 4 bodies under several meters of packed snow, with injuries that didn't fit a simple story of freezing. One had a fractured skull with no wound on the scalp. 2 others had severe chest fractures on the level of a car accident, again with no broken skin. Catastrophic internal damage with an intact exterior. A very specific injury pattern pointing to blunt, distributed force rather than a blow from a fist, weapon, or animal. Other details deepen the mystery. The 4 in the ravine wore clothing clearly cut from the 2 found near the cedar, suggesting survivors had stripped the dead for warmth before dyeing themselves. One woman's body was missing soft tissue around the eyes and mouth. Dramatic on the surface, though pathologists note that a body submerged in a stream for months loses its softest tissue first to decomposition and small aquatic organisms, a far less sensational but medically established explanation. Testing on recovered clothing found slightly elevated radiation, not enough to harm anyone, but enough in a secretive Cold War state to plant lasting suspicion. The official investigation closed within months, concluding only that the hikers died from an unnamed, compelling force of nature. No avalanche was named, no storm was named. The file was sealed, the area closed to hikers for years, and the families left with almost nothing. Into that blank space, decades of competing theories poured in, each collapsing against some piece of evidence. An avalanche seemed obvious, since falling snow can cause internal injury without external wounds, but the slope was measured at only 15 or 16 degrees, far gentler than what typically triggers a slab, and searchers found no debris field or fracture line. A secret military test was popular given the Cold War setting and the radiation readings, but there was no crater, no scorching, no blast signature at all. Theories involving local Mansi hunters were dropped almost immediately, since the only footprints on that slope belonged to the hikers. Theories of infighting or murder ran into the same wall. The tracks moved downhill together, calmly, with no sign of struggle. Whatever drove them out, they all reacted the same way, at the same time, together. That, more than any single injury, is what has haunted investigators most. These weren't novices who panicked at a strange noise. They were experienced winter travelers who understood better than almost anyone what leaving a tent without boots meant in that cold, and they did it anyway, apparently, without hesitation. Whatever happened in or near that tent was frightening enough to make near-certain death by freezing seem like the safer option. For 6 decades, that single fact was the wall every theory eventually hit. It's easy to imagine one frightened person making a bad decision in the dark. It's much harder to imagine 9 trained, disciplined people making the exact same fatal decision within moments of each other, unless whatever they were reacting to was immediate, physical, and unmistakable to all of them at once. The case was formally reopened more than once over the following decades, by journalists chasing a scoop and, eventually, by Russian prosecutors responding to pressure from the surviving families, who by then had spent a lifetime without a real answer. Each reopening produced headlines, and each one ultimately closed again without anything close to certainty. By the 21st century, Dyatlov Pass had become less a criminal case and more a kind of shared cultural puzzle, revisited endlessly in books, documentaries, and online forums, with every new generation of investigators convinced they might be the ones to finally crack it. What finally moved the needle wasn't a new witness or a hidden document, but a pair of engineers specializing in avalanche mechanics who approached the case like a structural failure to be modeled. Using snow slab simulation software and biomechanical data on how the human body responds to blunt, distributed force, they rebuilt the slope digitally using real terrain, real wind, and snow loading conditions from that period, and one crucial detail. The hikers had cut a flat platform into the hillside to pitch their tent. That detail turned out to be the missing piece. Cutting a shelf into a slope can undercut a layer of wind-packed snow sitting above a weaker layer beneath it. It doesn't collapse immediately. It creates a structure balanced at the edge of failure, one that can hold for hours while wind keeps loading fresh snow on top. The model suggests exactly that happened. A small, localized slab, not a roaring avalanche, broke loose hours after the tent was pitched, while the hikers lay relaxed and likely asleep. This small slab scenario resolves the detail that broke every earlier theory. A slab too small to bury the tent or leave debris weeks later can still deliver a short, violent impact to whoever lies directly beneath it. With people lying on a hard-packed floor, their skis and gear stacked underneath like a rigid surface, a block of dense snow landing on top can crush ribs and skulls with tremendous internal force while leaving the skin above untouched, similar physics to severe internal injuries from certain vehicle collisions. It was never a strike from outside. It was a crushing press between the weight above and the unyielding surface below. From there, the rest falls into place without anything supernatural. A slab lets go in total darkness. A few of the strongest are hurt immediately, some critically. The others, fearing a larger collapse, Do what trained mountaineers instinctively do when snow above them starts moving: get away from the slope fast. The tent's entrance may have been buried or jammed, so they cut their way out. They carried or dragged the injured, leaving in socks or bare feet because pausing for boots felt like too great a risk, and adrenaline can make cold feel briefly survivable in a way a second slide does not. They reached the tree line, tried and failed to build a lasting fire, and then the slower killer, the cold they'd always respected, finished what the slab started. Some tried climbing back toward the tent for supplies and simply ran out of strength partway there. The missing soft tissue and the radiation trace, most plausibly to camping lanterns of the period and one hiker's earlier work at a facility handling radioactive materials, both far more mundane than the internet has usually preferred. It's worth being honest about what this model proves and doesn't. It isn't a confession or new physical evidence pulled from the mountain. It demonstrates that the slab avalanche explanation, long dismissed as impossible on a slope that gentle, is in fact physically coherent, and that a small, delayed, localized slide can account for every major piece of evidence at once: the cut tent, the barefoot retreat, the internal injuries with no external wounds, the group staying together downhill, and the eventual deaths from exposure. That's why it's become the leading scientific account, even among researchers who stopped short of calling it definitive, since everyone who could confirm it firsthand died that night, and the snow that held the final proof melted away decades ago. Skeptics still raise fair points. Some hikers were experienced enough with avalanche conditions that critics wonder whether they'd have made the platform-cutting mistake the model requires. No classic avalanche debris was ever photographed by the original searchers, though the model's defenders argue that's the point. A slide this small, delayed, and specific wouldn't leave the dramatic debris field anyone was looking for in 1959. Both sides are engaging honestly with the same limited, frozen set of facts, because total certainty left that mountain with the 9 people who died there. What the science offers, even without absolute proof, is something quieter than a tidy solution. It takes the monster out of the story. For 60 years, the horror of Dyatlov Pass lived in the unknown, in the idea that something deliberate reached into that tent in the dark. The version modern engineering offers instead is, in its own way, more unsettling precisely because it's so ordinary. 9 capable, careful, well-prepared young people did nearly everything right, made one nearly invisible mistake in how they cut their tent platform into the snow, and were killed by nothing more sinister than physics, wind, and cold. There was no enemy on that mountain. There was only the mountain behaving exactly like a mountain can, once, under conditions almost no one would have thought to fear. So, here's the question worth sitting with. If the physics really does account for every wound, every footprint, every strange detail that fueled 60 years of speculation, does that finally let the story rest? Or is the idea that it was simply snow, wind, and a badly timed shelf cut into a hillside somehow more unsettling than any of the wilder theories ever were? Let me know which version you find more convincing, and if stories like this interest you, there's more where this came from.